Inside Red Onion State Prison, there are places designed not just to punish, but to erase. Places where silence is enforced, where human contact becomes a memory, and where time stretches so thin it almost disappears. Hidden deep in the mountains of Virginia stands one of the most restrictive prisons in America. Inside Red Onion State Prison, isolation is not temporary. For some, it becomes a way of life. And what happens behind those concrete walls is something few people ever truly understand. The location no one sees. Red Onion State Prison wasn't built in a city. It wasn't meant to be seen. It sits in Wise County, Virginia, far from major highways, far from oversight, far from the everyday world. The journey there feels intentional, as if distance itself is part of the punishment. The closer you get, the quieter it becomes. No traffic. No crowds. Just trees, mountains, and eventually, concrete. From the outside, it looks like a standard high-security prison. Tall fences layered with razor wire. Guard towers positioned with precision. Motion sensors tracking movement. But Red Onion isn't just maximum security. It's a place designed for control, absolute control. Most of the men sent here aren't just serving time. They've already been labeled as too dangerous, even for other prisons. And that raises a question: what happens when you send the worst of the worst to a place built to contain them? The answer begins the moment they arrive. Intake, stripping away identity. The first thing taken isn't freedom. It's identity. New arrivals at Red Onion are processed through an intake system designed to break routine, expectation, and control. Every movement is directed. Every word monitored. Clothes are removed. Personal belongings are catalogued or discarded. A number replaces a name. Inmates are issued standard uniforms. Neutral. Identical. No individuality. No expression. Even eye contact is limited. Conversations are short, controlled, often discouraged. The message is clear from the beginning: you are not here to exist freely. You are here to be managed. From intake, many are placed directly into segregation. Not as punishment, but as a starting point. A place where the rules are different. A place where time behaves differently. And what happens next is where Red Onion begins to reveal what it truly is. The cell, a world of one. A Red Onion cell is not large. Concrete walls. Steel door. A narrow window, often frosted or positioned too high to see anything meaningful outside. Inside, there's a bed, a toilet, a sink. Everything bolted down. Nothing movable. Nothing personal. For many inmates, this space becomes their entire world for 22 to 24 hours a day. Meals are passed through a slot in the door. Communication with others is limited to shouting through walls, or not at all. There is no shared space. No yard with others. No casual interaction. Just isolation. Day after day. Week after week. Month after month. And sometimes, year after year. At first, the silence feels temporary. Then it becomes normal. Then it becomes something else entirely. Because when you remove human interaction for long enough, something begins to change. And not always in ways you can see immediately. The daily routine. Life inside Red Onion runs on a strict schedule. But the routine isn't designed for comfort, it's designed for control. Morning begins early. Lights on. Count check. Officers confirm each inmate's presence. Breakfast arrives through the slot. No conversation. No interaction beyond necessity. Time passes slowly. Some inmates read. Some exercise in place, push-ups, pacing, repeating movements to fight the stillness. Others do nothing. Because after enough time, even motivation starts to fade. Recreation, if granted, often means being escorted, alone, to a small outdoor cage. High walls. Chain-link ceiling. No contact with others. Just a brief moment of fresh air, still surrounded by barriers. Then back to the cell. Lunch. Count. Dinner. Count again. The structure never changes. And that's the point. Predictability becomes its own form of confinement. But routine isn't the hardest part. What breaks people is what happens in between. Isolation and the mind. Isolation doesn't just confine the body. It reshapes the mind. In environments like Red Onion, where human interaction is minimal, the brain begins to react in ways that are difficult to control. Sleep patterns change. Days blur together. Some inmates report hearing voices, not from others, but from within. Others become hypersensitive to sound. A distant clang, a guard's footsteps, small noises grow louder, sharper. Time loses structure. Without external markers, it becomes hard to tell how long a day really is. Weeks can feel like months. Months can disappear entirely. And then there are those who adapt. They create routines within routines. Mental exercises. Imaginary conversations. Anything to maintain a sense of control. But not everyone succeeds. And when someone begins to lose that control, Red Onion has its own way of responding. Control and force. Order inside Red Onion is not negotiable. When an inmate refuses a command, or becomes disruptive, response is immediate. Specialized teams are trained for these situations. Movements are precise, coordinated, efficient. The goal is to regain control as quickly as possible. Restraints are used. Physical force, when necessary, is authorized within strict protocols. Everything is documented. Every action reviewed. But for the inmate on the receiving end, the experience can feel overwhelming. Because in a place where control is absolute, resistance carries consequences. And over time, many learn that survival isn't about fighting the system. It's about understanding it, adapting to it, staying within its boundaries. But even then, nothing is guaranteed. Because Red Onion operates on a system most people never see. A system that determines how long someone stays, and if they ever leave. The step-down program. Not everyone at Red Onion is meant to stay there forever. At least, that's the idea. The step-down program is designed as a pathway out of long-term segregation. A structured system where inmates must demonstrate compliance, stability, and behavior over time. Progression isn't quick. It can take months, or years. Each level comes with slightly increased privileges. More time out of the cell. Limited interaction. Small changes that feel significant in a place like this. But advancement isn't guaranteed. One mistake, one incident, can reset progress entirely. And that's where frustration builds. Because for some, the path forward feels unclear. The rules can seem rigid. The expectations constant. And the question lingers, is it truly a way out, or just another layer of control? For those who make it through, there is movement. For those who don't, the cycle continues. Power structures inside. Even in isolation, power structures exist. They just look different. Without physical interaction, communication becomes creative. Tapping on walls. Whispering through vents. Passing messages in subtle ways. Information travels. Reputations form. Some inmates gain influence, not through force, but through knowledge, connections, or past affiliations. Others keep to themselves completely, avoiding any involvement. Because in a place like Red Onion, visibility can be dangerous. Not physically, but socially. Trust is rare. And silence is often safer. But even silence has its limits. Because eventually, every inmate faces the same question: how do you survive here, long term? Survival rules. Survival inside Red Onion isn't about strength. It's about discipline. Those who endure the longest often follow unwritten rules. Keep a routine, even if it feels meaningless. Exercise daily. Maintain physical control. Limit emotional reactions. Stay neutral. And most importantly, protect your mind. Some inmates read constantly. Others write journals, letters, anything to stay connected to something outside. Because once that connection fades, the environment takes over. And rebuilding that connection becomes harder with time. But even with discipline, even with routine, there are moments that break through. Moments that remind inmates exactly where they are. And those moments can change everything. The weight of time. Time inside Red Onion doesn't move the same way. There are no milestones. No shared events. No sense of progression. Just repetition. Birthdays pass quietly. Holidays feel distant. Years can go by without a single meaningful interaction. And that creates a different kind of pressure. Not immediate. Not visible. But constant. Because when time loses structure, it also loses meaning. And without meaning, even the strongest routines begin to weaken. Which leads to one final question: what happens when someone leaves this environment? Do they return to normal life? Or does Red Onion stay with them? Red Onion State Prison was built to contain the most difficult cases. To enforce order where other systems failed. And in many ways, it succeeds. But control comes at a cost. Not just for those inside, but for what happens after. Because isolation doesn't end the moment someone walks out of a cell. Its effects linger. In habits. In thoughts. In silence. And long after the doors close behind them. Some never truly leave. Red Onion isn't just a place. It's an experience. One that reshapes time, identity, and the limits of human endurance. And what remains is a question that still doesn't have a clear answer. How much isolation is too much? When control turns into controversy. For years, Red Onion operated far from public attention. But over time, stories began to surface. Not dramatic stories told for effect, but detailed accounts, written in legal filings, letters, and testimonies. Accounts that described long-term isolation, mental strain, and systems that some believed were too rigid to escape. Civil rights groups began to take notice. Former inmates spoke about extended time in solitary confinement, sometimes lasting years. They described environments where progress through the system felt slow, unclear, or, in some cases, impossible. The concern wasn't just about punishment. It was about duration. Because when isolation stretches beyond weeks or months, it begins to raise a different kind of question. Not whether it works, but what it does to a person over time. Investigations followed. Reviews were conducted. Policies were questioned. And while the prison maintained that its systems were necessary for safety and control, the debate had already begun. But what makes this debate even more complex is what happens to the people who leave. Life after Red Onion. Leaving Red Onion doesn't mean leaving its effects behind. For inmates who spend long periods in isolation, re-entry into society can feel unfamiliar, even disorienting. Simple things become difficult. Conversations. Eye contact. Being in a crowded space. After years of limited interaction, the outside world can feel too fast, too loud, too unpredictable. Some former inmates describe a constant need for structure, even when it no longer exists. Others struggle with trust. Because inside Red Onion, trust is rarely rewarded. And that mindset doesn't switch off overnight. There are also practical challenges. Finding work. Rebuilding relationships. Adjusting to freedom. All while carrying the psychological weight of an environment built on control and restriction. And that raises another question. If a place is designed to isolate completely, how does someone learn to reconnect? The answer isn't simple. And for many, the process doesn't follow a straight path. The staff inside the system. It's easy to focus only on the inmates. But Red Onion is also shaped by the people who work inside it. Correctional officers operate in a high-pressure environment where attention to detail isn't optional, it's essential. Every movement is monitored. Every interaction carries potential risk. The job requires consistency, awareness, emotional control. Because inside a facility like Red Onion, routine can change quickly. Officers are trained to maintain order, enforce rules, and respond to incidents without hesitation. But the environment affects them too. Long hours, repetitive duties, constant vigilance. Over time, it can create its own kind of mental strain. Some officers adapt by focusing strictly on procedure, keeping interactions professional, limited, and predictable. Others find ways to maintain balance outside the facility. Because just like the inmates, they operate within a system that rarely slows down. And that system depends on structure. But structure alone doesn't answer every challenge. Especially when human behavior doesn't always follow predictable patterns. When routine breaks. Most days inside Red Onion follow a controlled rhythm. But not every day. There are moments when routine breaks. An inmate refuses orders. A disturbance begins. Tension builds, quiet at first, then immediate. In those moments, response is rapid. Teams move in. Protocols activate. Communication becomes direct and precise. The goal is always the same: restore order. But for those involved, these incidents leave an impact. Because even in a place built on control, unpredictability still exists. And when it appears, it reminds everyone inside, staff and inmates alike, that the balance is fragile. Once order is restored, the routine returns. But something lingers. A reminder that control isn't just maintained, it's constantly tested. The silence between walls. There are moments inside Red Onion where nothing happens. No movement. No sound beyond the building itself. And in those moments, the silence becomes noticeable. Not peaceful silence. But a heavy, constant absence of activity. For inmates, this silence can feel different depending on how long they've been there. At first, it's uncomfortable. Then it becomes familiar. And eventually, it becomes expected. Some learn to use it, to think, to reflect, to create routines. Others struggle against it. Because silence, over time, can amplify thoughts. Memories feel closer. Regrets become louder. And without distraction, there's little to interrupt them. Which is why some inmates say the hardest part of Red Onion isn't the rules. It's the stillness. Because in that stillness, there's nowhere to go. Small privileges, big impact. In an environment this controlled, small changes matter. A book. A radio. A slightly longer recreation period. These aren't major freedoms, but inside Red Onion, they carry weight. They represent progress. Movement. A shift, however small, in daily life. For inmates in the step-down program, these privileges become milestones. Proof that advancement is possible. But they also create pressure. Because losing these privileges means returning to a more restricted state. And that possibility is always present. So every action, every decision, becomes part of a larger calculation. Not just about today, but about what comes next. And that future can feel both close and distant at the same time. The passage of years. Red Onion doesn't change much. That's by design. The structure remains constant. The routines stay consistent. But the people inside do change. Years pass. New inmates arrive. Others move through the system. Some leave. Some stay longer than expected. And over time, the experience begins to shape them in ways that aren't always visible. Patience increases, or disappears. Focus sharpens, or fades. Adaptation becomes necessary. Because in a place where the environment stays the same, the only variable is the person inside it. And that process, slow, gradual, often unnoticed, defines what Red Onion becomes for each individual. Not just a prison, but a test. Questions without easy answers. Red Onion State Prison exists for a reason. To manage individuals considered too difficult, too unpredictable, or too dangerous for standard facilities. And in many ways, it fulfills that role. But the questions surrounding it remain. How long should isolation last? At what point does control become something else? And how do you measure success in a place where progress is slow, and often invisible? There are no simple answers. Because the reality of Red Onion isn't one-sided. It's a system balancing safety, structure, and human limits. And like any system built under pressure, it continues to evolve. But one thing doesn't change. Inside those walls, time still moves differently. Silence still carries weight. And every day follows the same question. Not just how to serve time, but how to endure it. From the outside, Red Onion is just a building. Concrete, steel, security. But inside, it becomes something else. A place where routine defines existence. Where isolation reshapes perception. Where time itself feels altered. For some, it's a temporary stop. For others, it becomes a defining chapter of their lives. And long after they leave, if they leave, the experience remains. Not always visible. Not always understood. But always there. Because Red Onion doesn't just confine people. It changes them. And once that change happens, the question is no longer about the prison itself. It's about what stays with you when the doors finally open. If this story made you think differently about life behind bars, take a moment to reflect on what you've seen today. There's always more beneath the surface, more stories, more truths, more questions that don't have easy answers. Stay with us for the next one.